My name is Ethan Blackwood, and I never planned to work in search and rescue. If you had asked me when I was 20 or 25 or even 28, I would have told you the woods were beautiful from a distance and murderous up close. I would have told you I preferred streetlights to starlight, sirens to owls, crowds to silence. I would have smiled like a reasonable man and said some practiced line about avoiding unnecessary risks. The truth was that I was afraid of the forest in a way that had nothing to do with bears or weather or bad footing. I was afraid of the way the trees could make the world feel smaller and older than it should be. I was afraid of the way sound behaved under a canopy, how it didn't travel so much as vanish. I was afraid of how easy it was to lose a sense of direction when every trunk looked like the last, and the ground rolled in patient, subtle waves that never seemed to lead anywhere but deeper. I was afraid because the forest had already taken my father, and it had done it without leaving a bruise. I was 11 the day he disappeared. He was a land surveyor, the kind who wore his work boots even at the dinner table because he couldn't relax if his feet weren't ready to move. He believed in maps the way some people believe in prayers. He could look at a slope and tell you where water would run in a storm, could read animal tracks like sentences, could find north in a room with no windows. When I was a kid, I thought he knew secrets the rest of us were too careless to learn. He took me with him when he could. He said it was good for me. He said it would teach me patience, attention, humility. He said the forest was honest. Cities lied. Buildings pretended to protect you while quietly trapping you. Trees made no promises and kept none. And in that, he said, there was a kind of purity. We were in a stretch of woodland that locals avoided because of the stories. Every region has its stories, and most of them are ways to scare children into staying close. But these stories were told by adults with voices lowered, told with a glance toward the tree line as if the woods might be listening. People spoke about hikers who stepped off a trail to relieve themselves and came back hours later with no memory of where they'd been. People spoke about hunters who heard their names called from the brush and followed the voice until they were walking in circles. People spoke about compasses spinning, about radios crackling with words that didn't belong to anyone on the channel. My father dismissed it all with a smile that was half amusement and half irritation. He said fear made patterns out of coincidence. He said people wanted the world to be more interesting than it was. He said the only mystery in the forest was how many adults could still get lost on land they'd lived beside their whole lives. That afternoon, the forest looked ordinary. That detail has haunted me for years, because if there had been fog, if there had been a storm, if the air had felt wrong from the start, I might have been able to file it away under bad luck. But there was no omen. The sun was warm, the ground was dry. Light fell through the branches in long, clean bars, and the creek we were following made a soft sound, like someone quietly turning pages. My father marked a tree with bright tape and told me to wait there. He needed to take a measurement farther in, he said, just a short walk. He told me not to wander. He ruffled my hair with a distracted tenderness and promised he'd be back in 20 minutes. I sat on a fallen log, swung my legs, and listened. Forest quiet isn't silence. It's a layered hush, a living pause filled with small movements and distant calls. I could hear a woodpecker somewhere. I could hear the creek. I could hear wind passing through the tops of pines. I watched ants march in determined lines and felt older than 11 because I was being trusted to wait alone. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 40. At first, I wasn't afraid. My father was always late. He'd get absorbed in his work and lose track of time. I called his name once, a casual shout meant to remind him I existed. The sound didn't travel the way I expected. It felt dampened, as if the trees were made of thick cloth instead of wood, as if my voice sank into them. No answer. I called again, louder. Still nothing. When I stood, the air felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like the forest had drawn a slow breath. The light under the canopy looked thinner. My skin prickled with an awareness I couldn't name. I remember the way my stomach tightened, the way my hands suddenly felt too big and too clumsy to be mine. I started walking toward where he'd gone. Within a dozen steps, the world shifted. The marked oak behind me looked unfamiliar when I glanced back. The creek sounded farther away than it should have. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks arranged in a pattern that made my eyes slide away instead of settle. I took out my cheap compass, a gift my father had given me to encourage my interest, and watched the needle tremble, spin, hesitate, and then point south, then east, then nowhere at all. I called for him again, my voice cracking, and somewhere ahead, very faintly, I heard something that might have been an answer. I ran. I wasn't careful. I tripped and scraped my knees. I shoved through brush and slapped branches aside. My father had always told me that panic made you stupid, that running blind only got you lost faster. But I was 11 and alone, and suddenly aware of how easily a forest could erase a human being. I reached the creek and found his gear neatly stacked on the bank. His measuring tape coiled carefully, his clipboard resting on top of his pack like someone had placed it there. His notebook open to a page filled with his handwriting. I remember the moment my mind tried to protect me by rejecting what I saw. I remember thinking he must be nearby, that he must have stepped away for some reason and would return any second. I remember standing very still, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for the sound of someone pushing through undergrowth. Nothing. When the search teams came later, they found no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no trail of broken branches. Dogs followed his scent to the creek and then stopped dead, whining, refusing to go farther. Volunteers walked grids, rangers combed ravines, helicopters circled overhead. My mother held my shoulders so tightly they bruised while she spoke to people with hollow eyes. They never found him. After weeks of searching, the official story settled into place like dust. He'd gotten disoriented. He'd fallen. He'd succumbed to exposure. Accidents happened. It was tragic, but natural. Natural. That word made me furious in a way I couldn't express, because nothing about it felt natural to me. It felt intentional. It felt like the forest had reached out, calm and patient, and taken a man who believed he understood it. For years afterward, I avoided the woods. I moved away for college, chose apartments where I could see pavement from every window. I built my life around bright places. I told myself I was fine. I told myself my father's disappearance was a wound that would scar over if I stopped picking at it. But grief doesn't scar neatly when there's no body. It festers. It stays open. It becomes a door you can't fully shut. The dreams began when I was 29. At first they were vague, a sense of being watched, the sound of a creek, trees standing like pillars in a cathedral. Then they became sharper. I would dream of people I didn't recognize, standing alone under the canopy, turning their heads as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. Their faces were pale with fear or shock or exhaustion. They would look straight at me, and in their eyes, I would see something that made my stomach drop. Recognition, as if they knew me, as if I should have been there. I started waking up at 3 a.m, heart racing, mouth dry, the sound of distant static lingering in my ears. Sometimes I would hear a voice through it, too faint to understand, like someone speaking from underwater. Sometimes I would smell wet earth in my bedroom, sharp and fresh, as if a door had been opened somewhere nearby. I tried to dismiss it as stress. I tried therapy. I tried medication. I tried filling my evenings with noise, with television and music and friends. Nothing stopped the dreams. Then, one night, I saw my father, not clearly, not fully, but enough. I was standing on a trail in my dream. The trees were too straight, too evenly spaced, as if they had been arranged. The air was thick and still. Ahead of me, a figure stood by a creek with his back turned. He wore my father's jacket, the one with the torn cuff. He held something in his hands, and for a moment I thought it was his notebook. I tried to move toward him, and the ground felt sticky, like my shoes were sinking into mud that wasn't there. The figure didn't turn, but a voice came from him anyway, calm and familiar, telling me not to come closer. I woke up sobbing, my chest aching as if someone had reached in and squeezed my heart. The next day, during a lunch break at work, I read an article about a volunteer search and rescue team operating in the very region where my father disappeared. They specialized in missing hikers, lost hunters, stranded campers. Their successes were described in measured professional language. But there were details that made my skin tighten. Reports of people found in areas already searched. Reports of victims unable to explain where they'd been. Reports of radios picking up transmissions from no one, of compasses spinning in certain valleys. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Something inside me made a quiet decision without my permission. I applied. When the confirmation email arrived, I felt no relief. Only the sensation of stepping onto a path I'd been avoiding for 2 decades, a path that had been waiting for me the whole time. Training was physical and unforgiving. I learned to pack efficiently, to read terrain fast, to treat hypothermia, to carry an injured person over rough ground without breaking their spine. I learned radio procedures, search patterns, how to control panic when the sun dropped and everything looked the same. The others in the group were a mix of backgrounds: former military, nurses, outdoor enthusiasts with an appetite for danger, people who said they wanted to help their community. I didn't tell them why I was there, but the forest seemed to know. The first time I joined a night exercise under dense canopy, I felt the air change the moment we left the trail. My flashlight beam looked thinner than it should have, as if it was being eaten. The forest grew unusually quiet, not in the way animals sometimes go silent, but in a way that felt purposeful, attentive. My radio crackled, and for a moment, beneath the normal chatter, I heard a voice that didn't belong to anyone in my group. Sounded like my father saying my name. I froze so hard the others noticed. Marla, our team leader, walked back to me and asked quietly if I was all right. Her eyes were sharp, older than the rest of her face. She looked like a woman who had walked into places she should not have, and come back anyway. I told her it was nothing. She didn't believe me. But she didn't press. After the exercise, she pulled me aside and said something I never forgot. She told me that some forests had personalities. She didn't say it like a superstition. She said it like a fact learned the hard way. She told me there were places that took people, not always physically, but spiritually, mentally, leaving them empty-eyed and wrong. She told me that if I ever heard my name called in the woods, I should treat it the same way I'd treat the sound of a rattlesnake. A warning, not an invitation. I asked her if she believed the stories. She said she'd stopped calling them stories years ago. My first real mission came in early autumn, the kind of season where the air turns sharp overnight and leaves begin to fall in heavy, restless drifts. A college student named Daniel had gone missing on a solo hike. Experienced, well-equipped, last seen checking in at a ranger station. His planned route was straightforward, and the weather had been mild. He should have been back 2 days ago. We mobilized before dawn. I remember the way my hands shook as I checked my pack. Not from cold, from anticipation, from dread. From something that felt like approaching a locked door I'd once watched someone vanish behind. We moved in teams, sweeping along trails and branching into grid searches. The forest was thick, older than the map suggested. In some places, the trees grew so close together that sunlight struggled to reach the ground. The earth was soft with rot. Every step sank slightly, muffled by needles and leaves. After an hour, my compass began to wobble. My radio crackled, then went dead for a long moment. Marla ordered us to hold position and reboot our equipment. Voices came and went through static. Someone on another team reported hearing footsteps that weren't theirs. Another reported seeing a figure between trees that disappeared when approached. I told myself fear was contagious, that people projected their anxiety onto shadows. I tried to focus on the practical details, the ones training had drilled into me. Keep your bearings. Mark your path. Don't chase illusions. Then I heard it. A voice, close enough that it felt like it was behind my ear. Ethan. My name spoken softly, with the tone of someone trying not to startle a skittish animal. My blood turned cold. The others didn't react. They didn't seem to hear it. They were busy checking maps and radios, adjusting straps, communicating with base. I stood very still, my flashlight beam trembling. Ethan, the voice said again. And it was my father's voice. Not a vague resemblance, but the exact cadence, the slight rasp, the careful way he used to pronounce my name when he was serious. The voice told me I was going the wrong way. It told me Daniel was close. It told me to come. Every instinct in me screamed to follow it. Not because I believed it was safe, but because something deep inside me still wanted my father, still wanted answers, still wanted to believe that the world had not simply swallowed him whole. But Marla's warning echoed in my mind. The sound of your name in the woods is not an invitation. It is a trap. I forced myself to take a breath. I forced my feet to stay planted. I focused on the ordinary sounds around me. My teammates' breaths, the soft crunch of leaves, the crackle of a radio coming back online. The voice shifted, as if annoyed. Ethan, it said, sharper now. And for a split second, the tone didn't sound like my father at all. It sounded like something trying to imitate him and losing patience. Then the forest went silent. Not natural silence, not the quiet of animals hiding, a complete absence of sound, as if the world had been wrapped in thick cloth. My flashlight beam dimmed. The air smelled wet like the creek from my childhood, like freshly turned soil. I felt the urge to turn my head, to look behind me. I didn't. I stared straight ahead, teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. After a long moment, sound returned in a rush. Wind, leaves, a distant bird call. My radio crackled with a teammate's voice, asking for confirmation of our position. I answered as steadily as I could. We found Daniel at dusk. He was sitting under an ancient pine, back against the trunk, eyes open but unfocused. He looked intact, no obvious injuries, but his skin was cold and his lips were cracked. He was dehydrated, weak, disoriented. When we spoke to him, he answered slowly, as if every word had to be pulled through fog. He said he'd been walking for hours. He said he'd kept finding the same fallen tree, the same cluster of rocks, the same strange hollow where the ground dipped like a mouth. He said he'd heard voices calling his name from deeper in the forest. Voices that sounded like his mother, his girlfriend, his best friend. He said he knew it couldn't be them, but he followed anyway, because the sound made him feel like he was about to be saved. He looked at me then, really looked, and his eyes sharpened with something like fear. He asked me why I had spoken to him. I told him I hadn't. He insisted I had. He said he heard my voice telling him to leave the trail, telling him I could get him out, telling him to come closer to the creek. He described the exact tone I'd used when I'd called to my teammates earlier. He described words I remembered saying into my radio, but I had never spoken to him directly. A cold certainty settled in my gut. The forest had used me. That night, after we brought Daniel out and handed him off to medical personnel, I sat alone in my car for a long time. The parking lot lights hummed overhead. The world outside the tree line felt ordinary again. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere nearby. Everything was reassuringly normal. And yet, I could still smell wet earth on my clothes. I went home and showered until my skin turned red. I threw my clothes into the washer, then ran the cycle twice. Still, the smell seemed to linger in my hair, in my memory, in my breath. I dreamed of the creek again. In the dream, I stood on the bank where my father's gear had been found. The water moved too slowly, thick and dark. Trees leaned closer than they should, as if listening. On the opposite bank, a figure stood with its back to me, wearing my father's jacket. This time, it turned. It had my father's face, but the expression was wrong. The eyes were too bright, too empty, like glass reflecting a light that wasn't there. The mouth smiled slightly, as if amused by my confusion. It opened its mouth. My father's voice came out, gentle and familiar, telling me that it was proud of me, telling me I'd grown strong, telling me I was doing good work. Then the voice changed mid-sentence, slipping into something lower, rougher, layered with a second tone underneath. And it told me the forest had always had room for one more Blackwood. I woke up choking on air. The next day, I considered quitting. I stared at the rescue group's number in my phone. My fingers hovered over it. I imagined walking away, returning to pavement and light, pretending this was all a psychological echo of childhood trauma. But Daniel's face kept appearing in my mind, the way his eyes had sharpened when he said he heard my voice. The forest hadn't just taken my father. It was still hunting. It was still luring people off trails with familiar sounds. It was still turning their hope into a weapon. And now it knew it could use me. That should have been the final reason to run. Instead, it became the reason I stayed. Because I understood something then that I hadn't understood as a child. The forest did not take everyone. It did not win every time. People came back. Not always whole, not always the same, but alive. And if something in those woods was calling out with borrowed voices, then it mattered who answered. I couldn't stop the forest from being what it was, whatever that was. But I could put myself between it and the next person it tried to swallow. I could be present when the compass spun and the radio screamed with static. I could recognize the moment the air thickened, the moment the light thinned, the moment the silence became intentional. I could tell someone not to follow the voice that sounded like their wife. I could keep them moving when the trail seemed to loop back on itself. I could drag them, if I had to, out of the place where the trees pressed too close together and the ground felt like a mouth. Mission by mission, I learned the patterns. There were valleys where you should never call out a name, because the forest would call it back. There were creeks you should never cross after sundown, because the water carried sound in ways you couldn't predict. There were groves of older trees where your flashlight would dim and your thoughts would slip, where you would forget what you were doing and feel a sudden urge to sit down and rest. And always, there were voices. Sometimes they were crude imitations, wrong in tone, wrong in rhythm. Those were easier to resist. The dangerous ones were perfect. The dangerous ones carried the exact warmth you remembered, the exact patience, the exact private softness that no stranger should have been able to mimic. The forest did not just know names, it knew histories, it knew wounds, it learned people by listening. One winter, we searched for a missing couple who had gone snowshoeing on a familiar trail. A simple day outing. They vanished less than a mile from the parking area. We found their tracks leading off into the trees as if they had decided, suddenly and together, to leave the safety of the path. They were alive when we found them, huddled beneath a rock overhang, their hands locked together so tightly their fingers had turned purple. They kept insisting they had heard their little boy calling for them. They kept sobbing when we told them their son was safe at home with grandparents. The wife asked me, in a voice shredded by cold, why the forest sounded so convincing. I didn't know how to answer. Another time, we searched for a man with dementia who wandered from his care facility. We found him walking calmly deeper into the woods, smiling as if he were headed toward a welcoming home. When we tried to stop him, he became furious, clawing at our arms, yelling that we were keeping him from his mother. His mother, he said, was waiting just ahead. He died later that night in the hospital from complications, and I lay awake afterward wondering if the forest had been kind in its own way, offering him a familiar voice as it drew him in, or if it had simply found the easiest bait. I kept doing the work because every person we brought out felt like a small theft, a small act of defiance. I kept doing it because I couldn't stand the idea of the forest taking someone else the way it took my father, leaving a family to rot on unanswered questions. But there was another reason, the one I never say out loud. Every time we went in, some part of me listened for my father's voice. Not the false one, not the thing wearing his tone like a mask, but the real one. The man who had believed in maps. The man who had told me the forest was honest. The man who had promised he'd be back in 20 minutes. I told myself it was impossible. I told myself the dead don't linger in creeks and trees. Yet there were moments, rare and fleeting, when the voice calling my name sounded tired instead of hungry. When it sounded distant, like someone shouting through layers of earth. When it didn't try to lure me, but instead seemed to warn me away. Once, during a spring search after heavy rains, we moved into an area where the creek had flooded its banks. The forest smelled raw. The ground squelched under boots. Mist rose between trunks like breath. The radios were unstable, and the compass needle kept twitching like a living thing. Marla gave the order to pull back. She said the woods felt wrong. She said she'd learned to trust that feeling more than any map. As the team turned, I lagged behind for a moment, staring at the flooded creek. Water moved fast, dark and cold, carrying broken branches. My reflection in it looked stretched, warped, unfamiliar. And then I heard it. Ethan. My father's voice, so soft, I almost missed it. But this time it wasn't calling me deeper. It wasn't tempting. It wasn't sweet. It was afraid. Ethan, it whispered again. And I realized the voice wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the water. From beneath the rush, from beneath the current. as if it had been trapped there for years, pressed under the surface, forced to speak through liquid and rock. "Don't listen," the voice said, and the words broke apart around bubbles and rushing noise. But I understood them anyway. "Don't listen to it. It learns you. It wears you. It wants you to walk in and stop walking out." My throat closed. Tears stung my eyes so suddenly it felt like being hit. I took a step toward the creek before I could stop myself. The water surged, and for a split second, something pale and long moved beneath the surface. Not a fish, not a branch. Something that turned like a body turning over in sleep. Something that made the hair rise on my arms. My father's voice spoke again, desperate now, and I heard something else underneath it. The layered tone, the hungry thing that always tried to imitate him. The two voices overlapped, fighting for the same space, like two hands tugging at the same mask. "Ethan," it said, "come closer." "Ethan," my father's voice said, "don't." My heart hammered so hard I thought I might vomit. The forest around me felt like it was leaning in. The air thickened. The mist seemed to hold its breath. Behind me, I heard my teammates calling my name, their voices distant, muffled, as if they were speaking from another world. I stared at the water and realized the cruelest truth I had ever understood. The forest did not keep people like trophies. It kept them like tools. It kept enough of them to bait the next ones. It kept enough of their voices, their memories, their private tenderness, to make you trust the wrong sound in the dark. And sometimes, if you were lucky or cursed, something of the person remained aware inside that trap, aware enough to try to warn you, aware enough to suffer. My father had been there all along, not as a ghost drifting free, but as a voice pinned under the surface, forced to speak when the forest wished, forced to watch as strangers followed him deeper. And now it wanted me. Not because it hated me, not because it was angry, but because it recognized a pattern, a bloodline, a name that had already been taken once. It wanted to complete the shape it had started. I backed away from the creek, step by shaking step, forcing myself not to run, forcing myself not to turn my back. My boots slid in mud. Water splashed. The pale shape beneath the surface shifted again, as if reacting to my movement, as if annoyed. "Ethan," the layered voice called. And now it sounded like my mother too, like my childhood friend, like every person I had ever trusted. It threw familiar sounds at me like hooks, trying to snag whatever part of me was weakest. I clamped my hands over my ears and kept backing away until I collided with Marla's chest. She grabbed my shoulders and held me steady, her face tight with understanding that didn't require explanation. "We're leaving," she said. Her voice was firm enough to slice through the fog in my head. We left. We found the missing hiker we were searching for later, alive, stuck in a mudslide farther uphill. We carried him out. We saved him. The news report later called it a successful operation. People praised the team. They said we were heroes. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had walked to the edge of a mouth and managed, somehow, not to step in. That night, when I lay in bed, the smell of wet earth clung to my skin, no matter how much I washed. In the dark, my bedroom felt too quiet. I could hear the distant sound of water in my pipes and imagine it was a creek running under my floorboards. I could hear the faint hum of electricity and imagine it was a radio filled with static. I closed my eyes and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, very faintly, like a transmission struggling through interference, I heard my father's voice again, not calling my name, not luring, not imitating affection, just breathing, a slow, exhausted sound, like someone holding on. It made something in my chest break open and bleed. I understood then, with a clarity that left me shaking, why I could never quit. Not because I was brave, not because I was noble, not because I wanted to be a good man, because every time I went into the forest with my radio and my compass and my training, I was not just searching for strangers. I was keeping the door open. I was making noise in a place that wanted silence. I was refusing to let the woods take people without a fight. And selfishly, quietly, I was listening for the real voice under the borrowed ones, the warning voice under the hunger, the last honest fragment of a man who had believed the forest could be understood. I don't know if my father can ever be brought out. I don't know if what remains of him is even something that can be saved. I don't know if the forest is a living thing or a sickness in the land or something older wearing trees as its skin. But I know this. When someone goes missing in those woods, I go in after them. Because I have heard what happens when the forest gets time to learn you. I have heard what it does with your voice. I have heard my own name, spoken in tones that were never mine. And one day, I will step off a trail, and the air will thicken, and the light will thin, and a perfect voice will call me with all the warmth I have ever needed. And if I am lucky, I will remember that the forest does not call you to bring you home. It calls you so it can finally stop hearing you struggle.